The morning of March 7, 1944, dawned cold and gray over the experimental testing facility at Rechlin, 40 miles north of Berlin. Oberst Werner Hoffmann stood in the frozen grass beside a peculiar piece of wreckage that had been delivered just hours before. A teardrop-shaped tank, scorched but intact, retrieved from a field in Brandenburg where American fighters had engaged the Luftwaffe the previous day. The first American fighter escort mission to Berlin. The mission that changed everything. For months, German intelligence had tracked the American bomber streams with scientific precision. They knew the ranges of every Allied fighter down to the kilometer. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach maybe 280 miles before turning back. The P-38 Lightning, perhaps 300 miles with external tanks. These were mathematical certainties, ironclad calculations that dictated the entire defensive strategy of the Reich. German fighter wings simply waited beyond the escort range, then fell upon the unprotected bombers like wolves on sheep. It was a formula written in blood and mathematics, and it worked. But yesterday, American fighters had appeared over Berlin itself. Not stragglers, not a handful of desperate pilots gambling their fuel reserves. Entire squadrons of sleek silver Mustangs, wheeling and diving through the flak, staying with the bombers all the way to the target and back. It was impossible. Berlin lay 520 miles from the American bases in England. The P-51 Mustang, according to every intelligence assessment, every technical manual, could not fly that distance and fight and return home. Yet they had done exactly that. Hoffmann knelt beside the strange tank, running his gloved hand along its surface. It felt wrong, too light. He tapped it with his knuckle, expecting the ring of metal. Instead, a dull thud answered back. His stomach tightened. He drew his knife and carefully scraped at the scorched exterior. Paper. Layer upon layer of paper, impregnated with resin and formed into an aerodynamic shell. He looked up at Hauptmann Klaus Fischer, the Luftwaffe's chief technical intelligence officer, who had driven through the night to be here. "Klaus, tell me this is a joke. Tell me the Americans are not crossing the Reich with fuel tanks made of paper." Fischer's face was ashen. "It gets worse, Werner. Much worse." He gestured to the other items laid out on the tarpaulin. Fragments of aluminum, fuel line fittings, technical diagrams hastily sketched by field units who had examined crashed Mustangs. "We've analyzed 7 of these tanks recovered in the last 48 hours. Each one holds 108 gallons. The Mustang already carries 269 gallons internally. With 2 of these drop tanks, we're looking at nearly 500 gallons total capacity." Hoffmann did the mathematics in his head, the same calculations that had governed German air defense strategy since 1942. Combat radius, fuel consumption rates, reserve requirements. The numbers formed a picture he didn't want to see. Dear God, they can reach anywhere. Poland, Czechoslovakia. They could fly to Munich and back. "Not just reach it," Fischer said quietly. "Fight there. Escort the bombers there. Loiter over the target. Engage our fighters at the times and places of their choosing." He pulled out a crumpled report, rain-stained and marked urgent. "This is from Jagdgeschwader 11, defending Berlin yesterday. Their commander watched a formation of Mustangs drop these tanks over Brandenburg, then climb to engage. He counted 16 of them in that one formation alone. 16 that suddenly became lighter, faster, more maneuverable, and still had enough fuel to fly home to England." The implications crashed over Hoffmann like a wave. Every Luftwaffe pilot had been trained to exploit the moment when Allied escorts turned back. That was when you struck. That was when the bombers were vulnerable. That was when you won. But if the escorts never turned back, if they could stay with the bombers from takeoff to landing, then the entire defensive architecture of the Reich had just become obsolete. How did we miss this? Hoffmann's voice was barely a whisper. How did our intelligence miss that they were developing extended-range capabilities? Fisher lit a cigarette with shaking hands. We didn't miss it entirely. We knew they were experimenting with drop tanks. We've known for months. But we assumed they would use metal tanks, aluminum or steel. Heavy, expensive, difficult to manufacture in quantity. We calculated, based on the weight penalties and production constraints, that they couldn't possibly deploy them in meaningful numbers before late 1944, perhaps 1945. He gestured at the paper tank with something between admiration and despair. But this is brilliant in its simplicity. Paper is everywhere, light, cheap. You use it once and throw it away. A single factory can produce thousands of these in the time it takes to stamp out 100 metal tanks. And because they're lighter, the range penalty is smaller. The Americans can carry more fuel, or more ammunition, or both. Hoffman walked around the tank slowly, his boots crunching on frost. On the western horizon, he could hear the distant rumble of engines. Another American raid, another stream of bombers, flying deeper into Germany than anyone had thought possible just a week ago. Have you reported this to Goering? I've drafted the report. But Werner, you know how he'll react. He'll call it defeatist. He'll say our pilots lack fighting spirit. He'll insist it makes no difference, that the Luftwaffe will still prevail through courage and determination. Fisher's voice dripped with bitterness. But we both know the truth. This changes the entire strategic equation. With escorts that can reach anywhere in Germany, the Americans don't have to gamble anymore. They don't have to accept massive bomber losses. They can attack any target, any time, with full fighter protection. A Kubelwagen rattled up the frozen road, and a young lieutenant jumped out, saluting sharply. Oberst Hoffmann, urgent message from Luftwaffe Reich headquarters. He handed over a sealed envelope, marked with red diagonal stripes indicating highest priority. Hoffmann tore it open and read. His face went gray. American bomber stream, estimated 800 heavy bombers with 900 fighter escorts, approaching from the northwest. Primary target, Berlin. Estimated time to target, 90 minutes. He looked at Fisher. 900 fighter escorts. Klaus, we can't win this. Not anymore. Not if they can bring that kind of strength all the way to Berlin. Fisher ground out his cigarette. The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. That's what Galland will say. Mark my words. He's not a fool. He'll see what we see. He picked up the paper drop tank, turning it in his hands. Do you know what terrifies me most, Werner? Not the tactical implications. Not the strategic shift. It's the industrial thinking behind this. The Americans looked at a problem, insufficient range, and they solved it not with some miracle of engineering, but with the clever application of materials at hand. Paper and glue. Thousands upon thousands of disposable fuel tanks. It speaks to an industrial capacity we simply cannot match. While we're hoarding every kilogram of aluminum for airframe production, they're making fuel tanks from paper and throwing them away after a single use. Hoffman stared up at the gray sky, where vapor trails were already beginning to stitch white lines across the clouds. Somewhere up there, American pilots were climbing to altitude, checking their instruments, settling in for the long flight into the heart of the Reich. Pilots who no longer had to watch their fuel gauges with desperation, no longer had to break off pursuit to conserve fuel for the flight home. Pilots who could hunt German fighters all the way to Berlin and still have enough fuel to get back to England for tea. We should have seen it coming, Hoffman said. Back in December, when the Mustangs first started showing up in numbers, we knew they had the Merlin engine. We knew they had excellent performance. We should have anticipated they'd solve the range problem. Anticipated with what? Fisher's laugh was hollow. Even if we'd known, what could we have done? Built more fighters? We're already stripping every factory of workers to meet production quotas. Trained more pilots? We've lost the veteran pilots who could have trained them. Developed jet aircraft faster? Those programs are years behind schedule. He shook his head slowly. No, Werner. This was inevitable from the moment the Americans decided to build the Mustang, and the British gave them the Merlin engine. We're watching the future of air warfare, and it doesn't include us. The sound of air raid sirens began to wail across the facility. Hoffman and Fisher gathered the evidence, the paper tank, the technical drawings, the intelligence reports, and hurried toward the concrete shelter. But Hoffman paused at the entrance, looking back at the sky. The vapor trails were multiplying now, dozens of them, scores of them, spreading across the heavens like the fingers of an immense hand reaching down to grasp the Reich itself. He thought of the young pilots scrambling to their FW-190s and BF-109s, climbing to intercept. Brave men, skilled men, flying aircraft that were the finest Germany could produce. But bravery and skill could not overcome simple arithmetic. The Mustangs had the range to escort the bombers anywhere. They had the numbers to overwhelm German defenses. They had the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the Reich could inflict them. The calculations that had governed air warfare for 3 years had changed overnight. Rewritten by paper and glue and American ingenuity, as he descended into the shelter, Werner Hoffmann knew with terrible certainty that the air war over Germany was lost. Not because German pilots lacked courage, not because German aircraft were inferior, but because the Americans had solved a problem the Germans had not even properly understood, and solved it with such elegant simplicity that mass production became inevitable. The bombs began to fall on Berlin 90 minutes later, exactly on schedule, and this time the Mustangs stayed over the target, weaving and climbing and diving through the flak, protecting their charges all the way there and all the way back. The paper drop tanks lay scattered across Brandenburg, empty and discarded, anonymous pieces of trash in frozen fields. But they represented something far more significant than fuel capacity. They represented the moment when German air superiority died, not in a single catastrophic battle, but in the quiet realization that the mathematics of survival had fundamentally changed. By the end of March 1944, the 357th Fighter Group alone would claim 57 German aircraft destroyed in a single day's action. The numbers would only grow more devastating as spring turned to summer. The Mustangs with their paper drop tanks ranged across the entire Reich, from the Baltic to Bavaria, from the Ruhr to Berlin, and in the frozen fields of Brandenburg, the paper tanks would rot away with the spring thaw, leaving no trace. But the strategic revolution they represented would echo through the final year of the war, reshaping the skies over Europe and hastening the end of the Third Reich. The Germans had examined the drop tanks, and in that examination they had realized they could no longer win the air war. Sometimes the most profound military innovations are not the products of secret weapons or technological marvels. Sometimes they are simply paper and glue, used cleverly enough to change the world.